we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about hidden gems of New England with Alison O'Leary, because I cannot wait to get outside and find really cool places to walk and hike and just enjoy after a year kind of inside. So I hope you all are with me. Before I introduce Alison, though, I just have a couple things to say. One is that we have captions enabled on this program, and you will see them scrolling across the bottom of your screen. You can enable them or disable them through the button that says live transcript, and you'll see it has some options there. And I'll put some instructions in the chat as well. I would like to thank the Cary Library Foundation, which funds all of our adult programming. We couldn't do this without them and the donors to the foundation. So just our appreciation to anybody who donates to the foundation. You can buy signed books from Alison from her website. I will put the link in the chat because signed books are gold. I'm a librarian. I don't get paid to say that, but I believe it's true. So we will be taking questions at the end of Alison's presentation, so you can put them in the Q&A. Please use the chat function for tech issues or comments. So I'll be paying attention to all of that. We are also live streaming on Facebook where people can put questions. I'll be taking questions from both. So with all of that said, hopefully very quickly, Alison O'Leary, we're so happy to have you here as we walk into spring, is an award-winning travel writer and journalist. She's going to be talking today on her book, based on her book, Inns and Adventures, which she co-wrote with Michael Tougias. And I'm going to bring up her website because I think it's a hoot with what she says she has about herself. She's an avid outdoors woman. Inns and Adventures appeal to Alison's sense of adventure and love for all things New England. Her favorite part of the book is dreaming of a sequel while exploring new hikes and swimming under waterfalls and tearing down white knuckle mountain bike hikes. So I think we're all here for you with that. Alison, and welcome, and thank you so much for talking with us tonight.
Thank you, Mina. It's my pleasure. Hello, everybody. My name is Alison O'Leary, as Mina just said. I'm an author of just a handful of books right now, but always working on my next one. And tonight I'll be talking about an actual guidebook published by the Appalachian Mountain Club called Best Day Hikes Near Boston. Here it is on the screen. And I have to say, the Appalachian Mountain Club does an incredible job with guidebooks. I'm sure many of you are members, as I am. Just to let a few of you know that when you have a guidebook with hikes, it comes with these fantastic grids that tell you where the hike is, how long it is, whether you can take your dog with you, whether it's suitable for snowshoeing. The book also has a locator map that shows where the hikes are in relation to Eastern Massachusetts. And as you can see, the title of the book is Near Boston, but actually the hikes themselves, there are 60 of them in the book, cover the whole eastern part of the state from Cape Ann to Wellfleet on Cape Cod. So it's kind of a misnomer, near Boston. And part of the reason why I wanted to do this book before I started sharing my screen is because I grew up in eastern Massachusetts in the town of Hopkinton back when it was a sleepy little town. And when I was a kid, you know, we were always playing out in the woods and everything and experimenting with stuff. And one day I was standing near my brother and he had a golf club. And he took a big swing in our backyard, and you know, this giant divot of grass went flying, as would happen when a 12-year-old takes a swing with a golf club. And right there in the dirt where the divot was a gold coin. And we stared at it for a second. My first thought was, Dad is going to kill you for hacking up the backyard. And my second thought was, how did a gold coin end up here? Isn't that the craziest thing, that he happened to just slice that piece of grass out of the way, and there it was, and it said California gold piece, 1875. And I tell you, as like a 9 or 10-year-old, it got the wheels turning in my head. What was here before us? this was my backyard. People were here in 1875. That was really cool information for me to take into my imagination and try and figure out who it might have been. So now I will start my program, and that's just the background of why I am so interested in the history of land use in Eastern Massachusetts, and it just coincides very nicely with my hiking book. So I'll begin to share my screen, and here is a picture of the cover of the book, Best Day Hikes Near Boston. And one of my co-authors includes a photographer named John Burke and my partner, Michael Tougias, who you probably know as one of the authors of The Finest Hours, which became a Disney movie back in 2016. Here we are at the debut in downtown Boston. But Mike is actually a 12-year-old boy trapped inside a 60-something-year-old man's body. And his first books before the sea rescue books that he wrote were all outdoors books, including guidebooks for the Appalachian Mountain Club. Together, we also wrote a book called Inns and Adventures, which you could also find on my website. It's a New England travelogue sort of a book. So when he and I travel together, I like to joke that people give us a wide berth on the highways because they're probably afraid that something's going to come flying off the car and hurt them. We like to be prepared for any adventure. But in fact, this book, this Best Day Hikes Near Boston, is great because it's close to home. It doesn't require a lot of equipment. These are hikes that you can get to in, anything from a half an hour to maybe a 2-hour drive if you were going all the way to Wellfleet. And it brings home that this pseudo-modern concept of forest bathing, where when you go into the woods, you can just feel your worries and your cares start to lift off your shoulders. I believe, I am not a doctor and I do not play one on TV, but I do believe that if you immerse yourself in the woods, your blood pressure actually goes down and your body releases pleasurable endorphins that heighten the experience and really wash your cares away. So I highly recommend it. And I think this book is a great way to practice it. So let's talk about the cycle of land use in New England. The Native Americans burned land to create new growth that attracted game animals. And when the European settlers came in, they culled the timber and started industries. Rocks became stone walls. And that brings to mind a book written by a University of Connecticut professor named Thorsen, Thorsen. It's called Stone by Stone. And he came from another part of the country. And when he came to New England, he saw all of our stone walls and he said, wow, this is really amazing. I mean, it's sort of like architecture and agriculture and archaeology all blended together, because the earliest settlers were very perplexed when they would dig a stone out of a pasture and roll it to the edge of the field. And the next year, another stone would be there in its place. They really kind of thought that New England was cursed because the stones just kept coming and kept coming. So I recommend his book. He did estimate that there's like tens of thousands of miles of stone walls in New England, throughout the woods, everywhere you go. And he also coined the term, I don't know if he actually did, but I heard it from him, beef, bacon, and butter farms, because the people who farmed in New England, the earliest settlers, were really subsistence farmers. They didn't have those huge fields that the farms out west could do because they didn't have to cut down so many trees. It was really hard scrabble work here. And over time, as people moved off the farms and started working in industries, the forests regenerated. Now I'm borrowing these pictures, from the Harvard Forest in Petersham. They have this great information on their website. When we look into a forest now, we see these skinny trees, which means that they're not that old. We see the stone walls, and oftentimes where there's running water, you will find evidence of an old mill site. They were everywhere. They dotted the countryside all over New England. I love going into the woods and finding old mills. So in this picture, it depicts approximately the ancient forests of New England, where the trees were of varying types and different sizes. We move on to the earliest settlers in the 1740s, who cleared the land and again moved all those rocks and started to create the stone walls. By 1830, over 80% of New England was cleared, and that was the height of the deforestation of New England. And the farmers began to introduce orchards. I noticed that just the other day was the anniversary of Johnny Appleseed's either birth or death. I'm sorry, I can't remember, but he had quite a legacy here in New England. That's a very interesting story in itself. And here's how the population was distributed throughout Massachusetts in 1810. You could see the big circles were the population centers, and Boston was only, I want to say, 30,000 people. I can't see that very clearly, but we were really sprinkled throughout the countryside on these tiny beef, butter, and bacon farms. But I challenge you to look at this picture and not think of chicken pox. And so that's why when you go into the woods these days, you find things like millstones and mill sites, because people truly were everywhere throughout the countryside. By 1880, they began to abandon their farms and the trees started to creep in. By 1910, they were already logging the white pines out of this field. As you can see, the loggers down at work in the lower right-hand corner of the picture. And then by the 1930s, there were mixed hardwoods starting to come back in, and the wildlife habitat was beginning to regenerate. Here's a shocking little factoid that I really find fascinating. There were hunting laws in New England as early as the late 1700s, because the earliest settlers had hunted out most of the deer and the game animals that quickly. So here's the earliest known picture of an Amazon delivery truck. This was a good use for all of that white pine that could be sliced very thinly and made into boxes. Remember, they would wrap them with twine, the good old days. Maybe you'd find one in the back of your parents' garage. And the final picture from this diorama is the 1940s, where the trees had truly grown back in, a lot of mixture of maple, oak, ash, and black cherry. And you can see the man in the lower central part of the picture there painting. And that is a signal that people actually had leisure time at this point in history, where they could start to, travel a little bit, and they didn't have to work 24/7 around the clock. The population distribution had changed dramatically between 1810 and 1900. Look at how the central part of the state had sort of emptied out, and people were gravitating toward the big cities. Boston had exploded. Let me see. Boston was now a city of 560,000 from, I believe, 30,000 in the earlier picture. It's really fascinating. And that's why there's a lot to find on these hikes. There are a lot of things that happened in our parks and our wild places long before they became parks. And again, when you look into the woods, now you'll see these things a little bit differently. Here's an actual picture. It's very grainy, of the way the stone walls crisscross the landscape in the olden days, one of the earliest pictures of New England, and how deforested it was. All of that lumber was used to build all of the homes they needed and, create the railroad ties and fuel industry, of course. So this is a side-by-side of the same area, deforested on the left and reforested on the right. I find that really fascinating. And let's not forget that even before our earliest English descended settlers, there were the Native Americans who lived throughout New England, had many, many villages and homes and hunting areas, but they did not build permanent structures the way that the British, the later settlers did. So we're starting on the North Shore here, up in the Ipswich area, with the Willowdale and Bradley Palmer properties, really beautiful parks side by side. Bradley Palmer's estate, Bradley Palmer Park started as an estate for an equestrian named Bradley Palmer. He was quite a man about town back at the turn of the 20th century. He was one of the founding attorneys of the Palmer and Dodge law firm some of you might have heard of. He stood in at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I for Woodrow Wilson. He was quite a well-to-do guy, but single, and wanted a place outside of the city to ride his horses and drive buggies and that sort of thing. And so he started to buy up property, and he ended up purchasing approximately 1,000 acres. I know from my research that 740 acres of it were owned by one single family. Back then, that was a time to scoop up some property. This is a little map of the things you can do on the Bradley Palmer estate property. There are wonderful trails. It's got some wetlands, so there are some water crossings, but it's rolling hills. It's a very gently rolling area where you don't have to climb any steep hills. And there are pockets of forest. This is what his estate looked like back in the 1920s. As I said, he was single, he left no heirs. His estate was eventually donated to the state of Massachusetts as a state park. And the building is still there for all of us to enjoy and to rent out for our personal uses, which is pretty cool. Because if you haven't been, you can take tours of the inside. You have to check with the property rangers, the state park rangers. Of course, in 2020, I don't think there were any tours held, but I don't know. This was his dining room, which actually had been converted from horse stalls because he was a guy who really loved his horses. But the woodworking is really spectacular and well worth seeing, the arts and crafts style. The property is also on the Bay Circuit Trail, in case you're interested in doing that. Goodness, now the length of it escapes me. It wraps around the outer ring of the Boston suburbs, part in trails and part on roads. So when I mentioned the property to my partner Mike, he said, "Oh, last time I was there, I got attacked by a goshawk." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "A goshawk. There are these hawks, and they perch in trees on the edge of fields, and it swooped down on me and tried to take my hat off." And I said, "Okay, well, wear my bike helmet when I go up there." So there's plenty of wildlife to be seen due to the mixture of uplands, dry uplands, and wet areas. And as I said, it's part of the Bay Circuit Trail. You'll see this sign in different places on these properties that I talk about. It's very suitable for cross-country skiing and snowshoeing because of the just gently rolling terrain. Really pretty. Now we are moving down a little bit. I didn't put my arrow in this picture, into the Melrose area, Middlesex Fells property. It was one of many parks created by the landscape architect Charles Eliot in the 1890s. Now, Charles Eliot is not very well remembered because he was an understudy. He worked for the much more famous landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted. And Olmsted is known for the emerald necklace around Boston and for Central Park. Charles Eliot, though, created a bunch of parks in the suburban Boston area. It's 2,600 acres. The hikes that we talk about in the book vary quite a bit in terms of terrain, but there are some cool things to see out there. Now here's a picture, an aerial map of the park, and right up the middle of it is Route 93. It really bisects the property right in half, which is very unfortunate. And just to orient you, on the left side are 3 reservoirs. On the right side is Spot Pond. You hear about that all the time on the news, right? When they're doing the traffic reports up by Spot Pond, you know, the traffic is at a standstill. And on the upper right corner of Spot Pond in this picture is the zoo. And the name of it escapes me. I'm sorry, having a senior moment. Most of the hikes that I talk about are on the left side of this picture in the reservoir area, starting with the Reservoir Hike, which is very gentle, right along the waterfront. And because the 3 reservoirs have causeways dividing them, there are plenty of opportunities to shorten or lengthen it as you care to, if you have time or if you need to get out of there. The Skyline Hike is aptly named for the views of Boston. The Rock Circuit Trail is a potential ankle twister, so I always caution people to be very careful. It's good for training, though. If you were going to go climb some big mountains in New Hampshire this summer, go to Rock Circuit and practice your skills for getting up and down those rocks. Now, again, up by the zoo in the Spot Pond area is the most historic aspect of Middlesex Fells. And now this is a little disorienting, because now Spot Pond is in that lower right-hand corner, and the other map had it, you know, in the upper right-hand corner, but it's over by the zoo and on the Melrose, Malden area. And the reason I'm talking about this is because it was the home of Haywardville. And back in the 1840s, a gentleman named Nathaniel Hayward had a rubber plant in this area and a silk dye plant. And he employed a tremendous number of people from the surrounding towns who, you know, did his bidding there. But one of his employees turned out to be none other than Charles Goodyear. Charles Goodyear developed the process of vulcanization, and as I like to joke, the uses for rubber just expanded from there. Don't say exploded, expanded. They went on to, you know, do all sorts of things with rubber after he discovered how to make it more flexible and pliable. You know, went from a rigid material to all sorts of uses. And from time to time, the rangers from Middlesex Fells will offer tours of this area, but don't go looking for these buildings if you're up there, because they no longer exist. Like good thrifty New Englanders, when the park was created, I believe that this entire mill site was kind of defunct by that point in time. They were no longer using it. All of the buildings got redistributed. They got moved out to different towns for different purposes. So they continued to live different lives, but just not on that site. I went up there looking for the mill site and found just woods. So you really need a ranger to tell you where to look and what things looked like back in the day. And this is where you can find the rangers for Middlesex Fells. This is one of the old estate properties right on the shore of Spot Pond, not far from the zoo, the Stone Zoo, that's the name of it, the Stone Zoo. And this is the welcome center for Middlesex Fells and the stepping off point for most of the tours. Okay, and now another map without an arrow on it. Here we are, we're moving down a little bit and eastward into Lynn for Lynn Woods, another 2,200 acre site, which belongs to the town of Lynn. And really fun stories here. It has a variety of terrain, rolling hills, again, wetlands. You may hear wood thrushes. These birds have this beautiful trilling call, or barred owls in the evening time. And it is the home of Dungeon Rock, as well as some other really cool landmarks. Here is a map of Lynn Woods. You can see they have their own Walden Pond that kind of bisects the property. There's also a golf course in sort of the center lower portion by Breed's Pond there. One thing that really caught my eye when I was researching Lynn Woods was that there was reference to wolf pits on the north side of Walden Pond. And I said, wolf pits, my goodness, what in the world was that? And I guess that several years ago, some of the town historians had the same question. You know, they had this area named Wolf Pits, but they wanted to get to the bottom of it and figure out what it really was. And what they discovered was, in fact, real wolf pits, that wolves would terrorize the earliest settlers of Lynn, you know, and attack their livestock. And so the commissioners at the time, of the county, I believe, paid a bounty for wolf pelts. So can you imagine that? Wolves roaming Lynn, Massachusetts. It's really amazing. So now, oh, here's a picture of a wood thrush on the right and the barred owl. The barred owl is the who cooks for you owl, very common in New England, but really fun to hear. Again, the evening is the best time, right at dusk, when you start to hear them. Also in Lynn Woods is the remnants of the the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, 1930s era government program, which is interestingly being talked about again. It put a lot of people to work when Americans were literally starving to death after the Great Depression. This was a product of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration that paid mostly male workers to do things like build towers. And you'll see a couple of towers in different park properties in Massachusetts. They also built a lot of roads and bridges in parks. I know in southeastern Massachusetts, they were supposed to eradicate gypsy moths. Even back then in the 30s, they were a problem, and those guys did not finish the job, unfortunately. But the coolest thing about Lynn Woods, and I'm going to have to start talking very fast because I know I'm already falling behind. Lynn Woods has Dungeon Rock. There's a really neat myth or legend behind Dungeon Rock that back when the British soldiers were guarding the port in the port of Boston, a pirate ship came into the Lynn Saugus area, and the townsfolk were up in arms. Oh my goodness, pirates are coming. And of course, you know, a couple of pirates got off onto a smaller boat and started to row ashore, and they had a chest of booty. And they called the military to come take the pirates or take care of the pirates. And a couple of British soldiers came, and there was some sort of scuffle, and a couple fell dead, and one of the pirates got away with the booty, and he ran up into Lynn Woods and hid out. He went under this big leaning rock and hid his chest of treasure up there, and lived in harmony with the townsfolk of Lynn for the rest of his days, until unfortunately an earthquake or something happened. The rock shifted and crushed him and buried the pirate and his treasure forever. Now there are a couple of holes I need to poke in that story, because you think about it a little bit, like if I had a treasure chest full of, say, gold plundered from other ships, would I live under a rock? I don't think so. So that's the real mythological part of the story. But then there's a really crazy, absolutely true legend that goes along with Dungeon Rock. And that is 200 years later, during the Edwardian era or the Victorian era, when people were into seances and Ouija boards, a man named Hiram Marble showed up in Lynn. He was a spiritualist. He believed that he could speak to the people from beyond the grave. And he said he had received a message from the dead pirate to come dig up that treasure. So people kind of went, okay, go for it, Hiram Marble. And sure enough, he started to dig under Dungeon Rock, and he sold people shares in the eventual treasure in order to afford to, continue living there and continue digging and to buy more tools. Over time, he was joined by his son, and they would hold seances and make a little bit more money and buy a little bit more dynamite, blast a little bit, keep digging all the debris away. And they made it about 1 foot a month of blasting and digging. And they both eventually died without finding the treasure, but they left a really cool 135 foot hole in the ground under Dungeon Rock that is actually open to the public at certain times of the year. So worth a visit to Lynn Woods. You have to check in with a ranger and see when that's open. They maintain a good website, I believe, that tells you when Dungeon Rock is open to the public. Now we're moving out to one that you've never heard of before, right? Walden Pond, made very famous by the philosopher Henry David Thoreau, former Concord resident. I recently finished a fantastic biography of him that was written in the 1960s, and I wish I had it here. I can't think of the author's name, but so detailed, really made me feel like I knew Thoreau. And it made me feel like I shouldn't be so snarky when I talk about him, because he was a very interesting guy for his time. And Walden Pond, of course, offers some lovely opportunities to swim, nice clean water there, lots of trail options. Many of them are very short. It's almost impossible to get lost because the pond is kind of hemmed in by busy roads and a railroad track. But the new Interpretive Visitors Center is really cool, and I highly recommend a trip over there if you haven't been recently. I will qualify that. However, I suggest going on a cold, rainy morning in the off season, because then you're guaranteed to find parking. When I called the rangers at Walden Pond to work on this chapter of the book, the very first thing I was told was, make sure you include information about parking. And I said, okay, I will, but can we talk about the trails? And we talked about the trails, and then she said, please make sure you include information about parking. Tell them to call first. And I said, okay, I get it. And when I went to visit the new interpretive center there at Walden Pond, which again is really worth the trip, I went in and I saw the ranger and I recognized her name from her name tag. And I said, hey, I'm the one who worked on the Appalachian Mountain Club's book. And we spoke on the phone about Walden Pond. And she said, did you get the thing about parking in? And I said, holy cow, yes, I did. I certainly did. And I remind everybody. And a weekday morning when it's raining is the best time to go. It's guaranteed to be quiet. I recommend staying far away on sunny summer days because it just is jam-packed. And actually, Walden Pond has a long history of being jam-packed because unlike Thoreau's poetic ruminations on nature and walking and finding yourself in solitude, Walden Pond has always had kind of a carnival atmosphere. In fact, when Thoreau actually spent his 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days living in a small cabin on the shores of the pond, there were many, many other people living in the woods there. And that train track that goes by the end of Walden Pond was active back then too, in the 1840s. So by no means was he alone out in the woods. This is a picture from, guessing from the car, the 1930s. There was a very busy campground. I understand there was a dance hall and Ferris wheel and you name it, that kept Walden Pond very active until I want to say the 40s, when people started to think that maybe it should be toned down a little bit. The land was deeded to the state back in 1922. And in fact, I have a note here that says it gets 500,000 visitors a year. 500,000, that is unbelievable. But one of his most fantastic, one of Thoreau's best works, I believe, his essay on walking is always worth revisiting. And it's just a wonderful thing to consider when there are no crowds at Walden or when you have a quiet moment. It goes something like this. I think I cannot preserve my health and spirits unless I spend 4 hours a day at least, and it's commonly more than that, sauntering through the woods and over the hills and fields, absolutely free of all engagements. What a life, huh? That to have 4 hours a day to just walk and think is really incredible. But again, if you find that biography of him, I know I don't have it here at this house. It's really worth reading to understand his whole philosophy. He was trying to live on as little as possible. And that is why he freed up all this time to just think about nature. Really fascinating guy. And
Alison,
there is
if you,
the new visitor center.
Alison, if you think of the title, I can look up a link for it.
Oh, good. Well, I think it's just a biography of Henry Thoreau, but it was published in the 60s.
Okay, thank you.
So again, here's the visitor center, which we should all be very proud of. It is a Massachusetts state park. And there is that quote from his essay on walking, which was published in the Atlantic magazine after he died. So now we move down into the South Shore. Let's see, Burridge Pond. It's on the Hanson-Halifax line. And it's a little unusual. I wanted to include more properties from the South Shore in this version of the book because I felt like the previous version really left a huge gap in the South Shore. And I currently live in Plymouth, and there are so many cool places down here. So Burridge Pond was something I really wanted to include. It's not a state park. It is a wildlife management area, and it's about 1,700 acres. So it's sizable, but the thing about it that's really cool is that there are wide open spaces, and we don't get that a lot in Massachusetts state parks unless you're out like in the middle of a lake. So think of Walden Pond, you know, it's very wooded, you're always under this canopy, but at Burridge Pond, it's pretty open, and I'll show you some pictures, and it's fabulous for birding. So here's a picture of it. Cutting right through the middle of it are old disused cranberry bogs, which is part of the reason why it's still open. To the upper part and the left side of the property line there is very wooded, but on the right side of the cranberry bogs is pretty open. And it used to apparently be an enormous cedar swamp. Now, you know, cedar trees, you often see them at old properties like old homesteads. They grew cedar trees because for the colonists and the early settlers for the area, cedar wood was very, very useful. It does not rot easily. So it was used in shakes for the roofs of homes, for cedar shingle siding, for fence posts. You know, it lasted a long time, but the Native Americans had medicinal uses for it as well. Now, the history of Burridge Pond is kind of crazy and interesting because it was settled back in 1905 by an industrialist named Henry Burridge, who owned copper mines in South America. Why he chose this little spot in the middle of nowhere to start a new industry, I cannot be sure. I don't know that part of it. But he started out by digging peat moss and running it, barges full of peat moss, down a canal to the Taunton River and selling it for fuel. He eventually built some industries here on site, which included, I believe, a light bulb factory. He had a railroad station built. He had big plans for the area. Unfortunately, his estate all burned down, and I believe he left town. Now, after Henry Burridge, the Cranberry Bogs were created, and I was really surprised to learn that around 1910, there were people canning cranberry juice as a health drink, which I thought was really, really cool. I mean, I think that probably coincides with that, that sort of Kellogg, what was that? There was a movie about probably 20 years ago now about the health movement back in the 1910s and 1920s. And I think it coincided well with that. But marketing it as a health drink was really cool. And so in later years, a munitions plant was sited on the shore of Burridge Pond, and they were cited, they were ticketed for lobbing munitions into the water to, blow them up and test them out, which is kind of nuts. But anyway, so now here's a picture of the cedar up close, and I believe that the berries contain vitamin C, and that's what the Native Americans used it for, was, things similar to scurvy that they could cure. And as I said, there's lots of wide open vistas, which is really beautiful. One thing that fascinated me when I started to research Burridge Pond was the number of bird species. And there was an Audubon survey of birds making their habitat here, and they found over 81 species. As I said, some of the property is wooded, not a lot of it, so there are some cart paths through there, but for the most part, it's pretty wide open. And when you're around the pond, you have the opportunity to see things like kingfishers, which zoom really fast. They fly really fast close to the water, probably looking to eat frogs and salamanders and things like that they can scoop up very quickly. They also have this really cool staccato kind of call. Wood ducks would not be unusual to see there. And now for the pièce de résistance, Sandhill Cranes. Yes, indeed. Sandhill Cranes, which are not native to New England. They're native to Central Florida. I see them down in the southeast coast of Florida quite a bit. Minnesota, I believe Nebraska, even some in Alaska, but never New England. So when they found Sandhill Cranes here at Burridge Pond, they scratched their heads and said, oh, they must have been blown off course, right? But in fact, no. They come back year after year and have established nests here at Burridge Pond. Now you'll know them if you see them, because these birds literally can look an average sized person in the eye. They're about 4 feet tall, and they're not afraid of us. Keep that in mind. You don't want to get too close. So that's our little tidbits about Burridge Pond. Now we're moving on to Whitney and Thayer Woods, which is a trustees of reservations property in the Hingham, Weymouth area. Yeah, it's a really neat area because there are multiple parks close together. There's Whitney and Thayer Woods, there's Wampatuck State Park and Weir Hill. So it's all sort of a conglomeration of parks with a couple of trails that allow you to crisscross among them. And there are some great glacial erratics, those big rocks in the middle of the woods there that are worth going to see. Cart paths, mountain bikers are very common there. Here's a map of just Whitney and Thayer Woods. You can see in the very bottom center where it intersects with, or where it abuts Wampatuck State Park. There's a bird sanctuary on the upper right side, so it's wonderful habitat. But some of the history is really fascinating because it was once known as the common lands of Hingham planters. Oops, that's getting ahead of myself. The common lands of Hingham planters were the sort of pasture lands that the folks living in the area used to, let their animals rove eat the grass or the hay there. That was in the 1700s. So again, it's crisscrossed with a lot of stone walls. Here's a picture of the Glacial Erratics. You just saw a glimpse of that. Another one, very popular with the rock climbers. Here's one of the early wealthy settlers. His name was Henry Whitney. And if you've ever read the book, The Race Underground, or I believe there's also a PBS special called The Race Underground. It was written by Doug Most, who used to write for the Boston Globe. Great book. It talks about the competition between New York, London, and Boston to build the first subway system. And Henry Whitney was a big player. He owned several streetcar lines in the Brookline area. So he was quite a wealthy guy. But the book does a very good job of describing what it was like to live in a city back around 1880, 1890, in one of these, New England cities like Boston or New York, where all of these streetcars were pulled by horses. It meant that on those hot, humid, stagnant summer days, there were thousands of horses trotting through the city streets, and the cities stunk to high heaven as a result. And that's why Henry Whitney decided to build this tiny little cottage out in Hingham so that he could breathe the fresh ocean air. So he bought up all of this property, and it was eventually donated to the Whitney Woods Association in 1943. There are some lovely paths there. Again, some of the properties were used for a Nike missile site, which is completely gone now, except for, here's a picture of one of the missiles that's hanging in the Smithsonian. The whole missile site is gone except for this old concrete block building that I guess some people have considered making some sort of museum to the Cold War, which would be very appropriate. But now some of the properties are wide open fields, and they're kept that way so that birds like the meadowlarks and bobolinks can continue to thrive. Because as you recall from what I've talked about, New England was deforested in the 1800s. That lasted for quite some time. But now that we've lost so many farms to development and the trees have grown back in, the birds don't have, these particular birds that live in fields don't have the habitat that they once did. So fields that are left open and just mowed once or twice a year are the habitat that they need. Now, moving on, I will continue to try and talk quickly. The Blue Hills, 6,000 acres, again created by Charles Eliot, landscape architect in the 1890s, spans portions of Milton, Dedham, Braintree, and Quincy. And this is the Blue Hills is the site of the first day hike. January 1st of every year, they have group hikes, and it all started here in the Blue Hills. Funny, quick story, as I start to run out of time. I took one of my daughters on the first day hike many years back when she was probably 12. And we started out with this enormous group. It was a beautiful New Year's Day, snow on the ground, but crisp and clear. And we're tromping around with this giant group of people, like probably 70 people. And I looked at her and I said, this really isn't any fun walking behind all these people. Like, we could be in downtown Boston. We're not enjoying any of nature. And she said, yeah, I know. And I said, let's take our own path. So without a map, we just took off in our own direction, and we hiked and hiked and hiked. And that was my first lesson. Never go into the Blue Hills without a map. It's like looking at a bowl of spaghetti, the way the trails just twist and turn and intersect, and it can be quite a mess. So these days, I highly recommend a phone app. You can either use All Trails or Trail Forks or Gaia, G-A-I-A, all of them will help you figure out where you are and try to keep you from getting too lost in places like the Blue Hills. There's a lot in there, as you probably know. Here's a trail map. I mean, it's deceiving because that's 6,000 acres. There's a lot of opportunities to get lost in there. Our book covers several trails, including the Skyline, which is a blue dotted trail. It would be very hard to see probably, that runs east to west, so horizontally across the entire map. It's very lengthy and there is a lot of elevation. I can recommend the Appalachian Mountain Club, whether you're a member or not, hosts hikes here frequently. I just finished a winter hike series. It was 6 weeks of 6 to 7 mile hikes every other week. And boy, they really put you through your paces. So it's a good way to learn about the terrain there, but I still think I would get lost if I tried to go in by myself. At the top of Great Blue Hill is this tower, again, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s. The CCC, when they were camped out here, they improved a lot of the roads, created bridges, and this tower is named after landscape architect Charles Eliot, the Eliot Tower. Beautiful views from the top. When I was working on the book, I asked the Friends of the Blue Hills to help me out with any pictures from the property that we could use in the book. And I was astounded at what they produced because there were so many wildlife pictures. And I thought, wow, I always considered the Blue Hills to be really kind of an urban park because of all the highways nearby. But in fact, it's quite a habitat for many different species, including rattlesnakes. Now, every summer, when the news cycle gets a little bit slow, somebody comes upon a rattlesnake in the Blue Hills because there are a lot of people hiking in the Blue Hills. It's super, super popular, always busy in the good weather. And the news goes wild over rattlesnakes in the Blue Hills. But in fact, they have always been there. That's where they live. If you don't go turning rocks over, you're probably never going to see one. Nothing to be really afraid of. The Blue Hills is also known for the meteorological observatory that was created in 1884, which is the longest operating in the country. And way back then, they used to fly kites up to 8,700 feet to test the weather and I don't know if they made predictions at the time, but perhaps it was one of the earliest places. As I said, it's always busy there. I was shocked hiking there throughout the winter how many of the trails were very well trodden, very well used, even in wintertime. A lot of people snowshoe there, you know, despite any type of weather. There's also this great ski hill, which was created by the CCC back in the 1930s. And as I said, snowshoeing is popular. It's just a year-round destination. And when you sit down on a rock to eat your lunch up there on a nice summer day, it's like the United Nations. There are people from all over the world who are visiting Boston and visiting the Blue Hills for that beautiful skyline view of the city and of the harbor off in the distance. It's really fascinating. So on the east side of the Blue Hills is the Quincy Quarries, which began in the 1925. Yes, these are the quarries of the scary movies, The Departed, and what was the other, Gone Baby Gone? I don't remember if it was actually in The Departed. But in 1825, they started to quarry granite here, and you can see right in the center of the picture, little tiny people standing on those ledges. It was really a fascinating operation how they managed to do this. They had a purpose-built 3-mile railroad that carried the big pieces of granite down to the river. I believe it's the Back River, perhaps. I'm getting my geography a little mixed up, but they would put the granite on railroad cars, take it down to the river, transfer it to barges, and then it could go anywhere. And the very first customer for the Blue Hills granite from the quarry, it was 9,000 tons that built the Bunker Hill Monument. And here it is today. The Quarries is a very popular rock climbing spot and hangout. It's really cool. I love the urban art, but that's just me. Some people don't like that. I love watching rock climbers. Fun use for an old property. I'm wrapping this up now with Massasoit State Park in Taunton, because again, the history of it fascinated me. Very, very early settlers went there in the 1650s. So no sooner had they arrived in the Plymouth area that people started to spread out, and they established an iron forge there because they found iron in the ground. They call it bog iron, which is a naturally occurring iron that had industrial uses. So they needed to refine that. And I believe, just from my own sense of things, that some of the hills that you encounter in the park were slag heaps from that bog iron operation. So there are still some working cranberry bogs. You can see the sort of clover leaf shape in the center right-hand side of the picture is the campground. Just north of that, there are some cranberry bogs near the entrance to the park. And there's a nice big loop trail that goes around the Middle Pond and Furnace Pond, and they call it Bear Hole Pond is the little one in the center of the loop. I love waterfront hikes. Really, I find it very soothing. There are a lot of nice tall pine trees here on the property. Again, the property was used to make bricks by the earliest settlers. There's Lake Rico, which is right in the center of it, accessible for kayaking if you're so inclined. It also has quite a few turtles, and it's a spot where Mass Wildlife releases turtles that they have hatched or rehabilitated, because sadly, most of the turtles native to New England are endangered due to development of the land and, you know, being hit by cars and that sort of thing. But you can find turtles there in Lake Rico at Massasoit. So again, the earliest settlers found that the clay in the ground was really good for making bricks. This is just an example. I don't know where the picture actually came from, but they would fire them to harden them, and then had many uses. I understand that their wages were paid. The people who made the bricks and who dug the bog iron out of the ground for refining were paid in iron bars, which is very interesting. And one of the earliest property owners here was a woman. Her name was Elizabeth Poole, P-O-O-L-E. She settled here in 1637 and owned over 5,100 acres. I think that's a really cool legacy for New England. There is a picture of some bog iron, really attractive, isn't it? And this is an iron furnace. There is no iron furnace at Massasoit State Park or in that area that I am aware of. This is in New Hampshire, up on the Gale River in Franconia. But just to show you, this one was built in the 1800s. It's 32 feet tall and the walls are 8 feet thick. And they kept the fire going day and night around the clock for 60 years to refine the iron found in the ground in the New Hampshire region. So I imagine it was something very similar down in Massasoit State Park area in general, the South Shore, when they were, you know, digging the iron up. So that concludes my program. I'd like to leave you with this thought. I took a walk in the woods and came out taller than the trees, attributed to Henry David Thoreau. And here is my website. If you would like to buy a copy of the book, it's my firstname, lastname.com. Thank you so much for showing up tonight virtually. This has been very enjoyable. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if I can answer some questions now.
Thank you, Allison. That was amazing.
Thank you.
You can, yes, take a break, have a drink. So I'm having a little bit of a glitch with my my Q&A. So I told attendees to go ahead and put questions in the chat. So I am paying attention to that. And I wanted to say that Kathy says the book that you were talking about a little bit earlier on was Road to Wellville.
Excellent, exactly.
And I was wondering if the biography you were reading of Thoreau was called a Thoreau profile.
I don't think so.
In the 60s. Okay, well, I'll keep looking. Early on, Sandra asked, are there any properties mentioned owned by the trustees of reservations? That was very early on, so I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about the trustees.
I do not know a lot about the organization itself. It is one of the oldest land conservation organizations. I'm aware of that. I think they do fabulous work. I did talk a little bit about Whitney and Thayer Woods in the Hingham, Cohasset area. That's a trustee's property. I don't think any of the other ones in this talk are trustees' properties, but many of the ones in the books, excuse me, in the book are trustees' properties. Because I am working on the next version, the next edition of this book, which will be out in 2022. And I've been in touch with the trustees recently about their properties. So they are scattered throughout Massachusetts, and a wonderful organization. I do know that Land's End is in the book, which is what, Weymouth, South Shore property that juts out into Boston Harbor or Massachusetts Bay. I'm sorry, I'm coming up blank of the other trustees' properties in the book, but what a wonderful organization. I actually, Rocky Woods in my old town, my old home of Medfield, is also a trustees' property, and it's in the book.
Okay, thank you. Peggy asked if the zoo near the Fells is the Stoneham Zoo.
I believe it's called the Stone Zoo, but you're on the right track. It finally, percolated through my head.
Okay, and Effie says that Land's End is in Hingham, Cohasset.
Yes, beautiful property.
So I have a question about starting a book like this, writing a book like this, because was it that you were already hiking and biking all these places and then you're like, oh, I want to share my knowledge? Or, did Michael come to you and say, let's do this thing? And then you started taking pictures and, thinking about what you would write up about it. How does that process start?
That's a good question. I actually did not, I was not in on the ground floor of this book. Mike had started much of his book writing career doing guidebooks on his own and for the AMC. So he was really the originator of a lot of AMC books in the last, 25, 30 years. He worked on many of their guidebooks. He has nature walks in Central Mass. I mean, I can't even name them all. So he had done the first edition of this book and was too busy with his other books to work on the follow-ups, the next edition. So he said, hey, would you like to get involved? And I said, absolutely. It's a good experience. Guidebooks are extremely precise. It's not the sort of, I used to write for the Boston Globe, so I know you've got to nail down every fact, but these guidebooks are truly, truly precise to the, let's say, to the 1 inch, level, where if the trail turns or if the markers for the trail change color or something, you got to be on top of it. We don't want anyone getting lost like I do in the Blue Hills.
No. In fact, that's two things I learned is one, always call Walden Pond for parking and always have a map with you.
Yes. Well, some of the properties are super easy. I think Walden Pond is super easy. You cannot get lost there because within 10 minutes, you're going to hit a road in any direction, a road or water. So you're very, very hemmed in there. But the Blue Hills, even after this 6-week program of hiking with a group over this winter, which was a wonderful, exercise for me to test out my winter gear. One day we hiked, the wind chill was 10 below zero. It was only like 3 weeks ago.
Oh,
But hiking with spikes on and poles and the whole thing was a great exercise. But still, I feel like the Blue Hills is kind of enigmatic. It's very difficult for me to see a straight path through it. It's very challenging place. So big.
gotcha.
Not to be underestimated.
Sally says something you had said earlier is called World's End.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, World's End. Did I call it Land's End? I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right.
We have a Land's End and a World's End going on in the chat. So this is a question more about the writing also that I'm interested in, because people are so digital now, but in the library, our guidebooks go out like crazy. Good. And we're always surprised by that because we think people are just going to go online to learn about these places. So is that what, is that what keeps you going and writing these things for an actual paper as opposed to just writing a blog or anything like that?
I actually do have a blog, just because you mentioned it. You can find it on I guess it's linked to my Facebook page. My blog is very eclectic though, all things outdoors. But no, I think that these guidebooks are popular because they're inspirational. You can use all the apps you want, but it doesn't, an app or an online resource just doesn't do the same for people, I believe, that a paper guidebook does, where you can flip through the pages and say, oh, wow, this place really sounds good, because an app is really just to get you in and out. It's not going to have the descriptive language. It probably won't have all of the detailed information that we include in the AMC guides. I mean, these AMC guides are really soup to nuts. They include everything: where to park, how to get there, can you get there on public transportation, what the hours are, what the restrictions are. You're not going to find that on an app. And as a matter of fact, if I could take 2 seconds, I'm all charged up because I had a great conversation with a woman from not far from Lexington. She worked for the town of Weston, the town of Framingham, perhaps Sudbury. Her name is Michelle Grisenda. I wonder if maybe she's listening tonight. We had a fabulous conversation. She works in the conservation department of different towns, or has over time. And she says that many of these apps scrape information from online maps, and they are not to be trusted when you're trying to follow a trail in the woods, because they very frequently have errors built into them because nobody is vetting the information. They're just scraping it from online. So I'm not sure if you understand how that works, but if somebody on their, dirt bike has a Strava or something running when they go through the woods on a dirt bike on an illegal trail, that could pop up on these apps that you might try to use to guide yourself through a property. And you may find yourself on private property and in a little bit of trouble, or in an area not suitable for hiking, an area of fragile habitat, that people don't belong. So it's better to use those apps with a grain of salt. What I do, I truly follow actual trails, but I use the apps to make sure I can get myself back out. That's where it's my backup plan. But the guidebooks only tell you where the vetted legal trails are that you are free to use.
Well, that's good to know, especially as we do use our phones more and more for those kind of things. But like I said, our books just don't stay on the shelves.
Oh, that's great.
So one last question. What is your favorite trail?
Oh my goodness, my favorite trail. Wow. Oh, that's a tough one. I love to hike near water, or with a view. Boy, that's challenging. Oh, I'll tell you, well, actually, I'll have to go off the map for this one. And this is just a little inside information. I live in Plymouth, and there is a wonderful, fairly new organization down here, a land conservation organization called Wildlands Trust. Now, I said new to me, perhaps. I don't know how long they've been around, but Plymouth is the town of ponds. Apparently, there are over 300 ponds in Plymouth. Beautiful properties to visit if you can, but many of them have homes built right up to the edge of the water around them. If you go to one called Halfway Pond, and it's just as, the way I said it, Halfway Pond in South Plymouth, Wildlands Trust owns the property, and what a spectacular walk. You can go pretty much around the entire perimeter of the pond. There are some trails that branch out into the woods. You can access Miles Standish State Forest directly from the pond trails. It's my favorite place. There are eagles nesting on the big island in the middle of the pond. So if you can get a glimpse of them, it just would make your entire day. It's worth the trip. So again, it's called Halfway Pond, managed by a Wildlands Trust in Plymouth.
Well, the way you just described it, I feel like I'm going to get in my car tomorrow and go.
Let me know. I'll show you around.
Thanks. I love that you included like bird watching and animal watching, in your talk, because I feel like, we all have such different interests. It's not just about walking, but about communing, I guess.
Right. I find that when you can slow yourself down enough to zero in on something like a bird song or a bird's motion or an animal, to like focus on the water and say, oh my goodness, I see turtles, or, I see pollywogs or whatever. Just that little eureka moment sort of, gets you excited, and again, releases endorphins, makes you happy. And it's that slight interaction with nature that so many of us miss on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm. So true. And I think we all need to get back to it a little bit.
If possible, yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I have to apologize again for my my webinar glitch. I hope everybody had their questions answered. I certainly did. But thank you again, and we'll be looking forward to your book. I did put links for buying your book and finding it at the library in the chat, and certainly we'll be looking forward to your next one in 2022.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for hosting me tonight. Take care.
Absolutely. Yep. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.